Hello, so today we're going to be doing a guide on pivoting, about when and where you should pivot your comp in TFT. Pivoting is something that's very essential in TFT, and it's a cornerstone of playing flexibly. So I want to do a little guide because I did have some requests, albeit they were a couple weeks ago, but I'm finally getting around to making this guide. So hopefully if you wanted to see information about pivoting, this will be a helpful resource for you, and it's going to be more geared towards like earlier game concepts and stuff like that. But anyways, if you like my content, please make sure to like and subscribe. A lot of you are returning viewers. If you watched a couple of my videos and I helped you out in any way, or if you saw something in my videos and you're like, that was kind of fun to watch, make sure to like and subscribe because it does help me out as a small content creator, and also turn on notifications if you're down for that as well. So what is pivoting in TFT? Pivoting is when you're usually angling or trying to play one comp and then you have to switch to playing another one. And it's very closely related to playing flexibly. You can also say it is the cornerstone of playing flexibly, because basically what you're saying is, my original game plan, I'm going to change it, I'm going to pivot and play something else. So I already had made a flex guide that deals with AP flex. AP flex is like a big thing that occurs in many sets of TFT. So this was a guide, I made it like a month ago. This was one of the early guides that I made. This is going to be similar to that guide. I'm also going to reference this guide a couple times during this presentation, but this is going to be more generic. Instead of just talking about AP in particular, just giving you tools that are a little bit more broad, so to speak, which I think is what people were asking for when they're asking me about pivoting. So why should you pivot? Usually you're pivoting when you're contested, so that means somebody else is playing the same comp as you, and the other person has a better spot. If you have the better spot in the comp, a lot of times you're not really incentivized to pivot. Whenever you're trying to play a comp, you should always play the comp that you have the best spot for, regardless of what other people are doing. That's a good technique or good idea to behold in TFT. If you have a really good spot for a comp, as long as you can play that comp, you should. If other people end up having a better spot, then you should look to pivot, because a lot of times pivoting could be pretty bad and could actually be detrimental to your game. Playing too flexibly is a problem. It's something that I also encounter a lot in my own games. I try and pivot all the time, and often I look back and I'm like, I was probably better that I didn't pivot. Additionally, you could sometimes pivot if your game didn't work out as intended. Sometimes you might be angling and you think that you have a good spot for a comp. A lot of times when you're trying to angle yourself towards a 4-cost especially, you run into a situation where the rest of the lobby is contesting the same 4-cost. You don't have a copy of the 4-cost. Well, guess what? You all of a sudden now don't have a good spot for your comp. Your game didn't go as intended, so you're going to have to pivot and try and find something else to play a lot of the time. Additionally, this relates to just not hitting the right units, quote-unquote right units, and especially in the current set, I feel like there's really good balancing amongst the units. I think that there are some comps that are like, you know, you might argue are way better than others, and some are really weak, and blah 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 blah, but I definitely think that you can play a lot of different comps as long as you can properly analyze how good your spot is for the right comp. So when I say you don't hit the right units, what I mean is your original game plan of hitting or playing one particular board, maybe the one in your team planner, doesn't pan out. Therefore, you should maybe try and find some other option to play around with what you have. So why shouldn't you pivot? This is like a big joke. I hear a lot of people say this, and there's not many people who should be saying this. This is a lot of challenger players are like, oh, I don't ever pivot because then I'm a known pivoter and people are going to know that I'm the guy that pivots, and then people are going to want me to pivot. This is just a meme. Unless you're like a top challenger player, I don't ever want to hear this, right? If you're in like, I don't know, I'm in Masters, and I swear to God, like, I rarely ever see the same names unless I'm playing at 3 a.m. and nobody's awake, and it's just like the same 10 people that are degenerate queuing at the same time. Like, nobody's gonna recognize you as a pivoter if you pivot. So let's get that out of the way. Don't, like, you know, I understand if you're like a top level challenger player, but if you're a top level challenger player, please don't watch my content. Like, my content's like beginner guides. I don't need somebody spell checking, you know what I mean? It's fine. But either way, the main reason why you shouldn't pivot, that's mostly like a joke. I'm kind of just putting it out there because I hear people say it a lot. But pivoting doesn't benefit your game results, right? A lot of times people will change what they're playing, and I'll give an example with a personal experience towards the end of this video when I get to it. But the idea is that you don't want to change your board and you don't want to play another comp unless you need to play another comp. So you shouldn't just pivot for the sake of being uncontested and thinking that you're going to cap higher. Often it's better to just play a stronger comp and to contest the stronger comp. You don't want to pivot and contest a weaker comp. You don't want to like pivot and play a weaker comp and then go bot 4 anyways. You want to play whatever. When I say weaker or stronger comp, I also mean the spot that you have for the comp, right? If there's like a couple people playing Corki in your lobby. That was an example I heard. Maybe I shouldn't use that because it's reminding me of a comment I got. Let's say like there's like many people and they're all playing around Rebels, and you have a really good Rebel spot, like you have a Jinx and you have a Zoe. The chances are you're going to be stronger than a lot of the other people in the lobby that are just scrambling to play Rebel. You shouldn't just pivot for the reason of, oh, I just want to be uncontested, it'll like be less stressful. A lot of times, like if you have a strong spot for a comp, like for example, if you have a win condition comp, like you have Unleash the Beast Urgot, you shouldn't just say, oh, well, somebody else is playing Urgot, I should just play something else. It's like, no, it's like if you're already committed and you have a good spot for something, often pivoting is going to lower your average placement. Even if you're contested and you both go bot 4, the chances are if you pivot to a weaker comp, sometimes you just guarantee yourself into a bot 4 if you don't have a spot for that comp and you're just playing it for the sake of being uncontested. So keep that in mind, right? Playing flexibly is fun, but don't just pivot without considering if it's best for your own game plan. Think about the current comp that you're playing and what you want to pivot to, and say to yourself, does my placement actually improve if I change my board? So, how to pivot. Whenever you pivot, something that you hear talk about a lot is that you need a pivot point. That's what I always recommend. Now, this isn't necessarily true for everybody, but for beginner players especially, whenever you're planning around a comp, you should always recognize what the pivot points are for that comp and just try and think about them. As you learn TFT, you'll become more comfortable with this concept. But the idea is, everything that you get in the game, you should treat it as, how can this be used as a resource that I can then use to pivot later if I have to in a worst case scenario, right? Find your plan Bs. That's usually playing around units, items, or you're pivoting within the line, which we'll talk about all 3 of these with some examples. So when you can also do a full pivot, which is very hard, and this is hard at all levels of play. You can watch a challenger level player absolutely throw their game trying to pivot too wide. You can watch a bronze level player absolutely throw their game trying to pivot their board. It is often very hard to do a quote-unquote full pivot, which we'll talk about in this video as well. But the idea is that you want to identify either units, items, or ways that you can play a line flexibly to give yourself a plan B. You should always have some sort of plan B, even if it's like, I'll never do that plan B unless like, heaven and hell collide and the world is ending. It's like you should still always look for these pivot points because it helps you out and it helps you to think laterally instead of just vertically, which improves you at the game a lot, even if you're not going to end up pivoting. So, pivoting around units. So this is an example that I put a lot in this AP Flex guide. There's a lot of examples of pivoting around units with this AP Flex guide, so I recommend if you care about that to watch it, but that's mostly towards AP. The example I'm going to do here is one that's really friendly to beginners, so I'm going to show it here. I'm going to talk about Rebel and Academy. I talk about it in every video because I think these comps are very easy to play and they're very beginner friendly. Academy is getting a little bit more difficult because of the way the meta is shaped out, but that's not going to be super relevant if you're like a beginner player and you're just starting to learn and you're not super high in your ladder. So we're going to use these as a basic example just to introduce the concept, and then you can use that to apply to other units that you might want to play, because Rebel and Academy are generally considered some of the quote-unquote weaker comps. But anyways, let's say you're playing around Rebel. When you're playing around Rebel, you usually want to play around Jinx. That's why it's really high. It caps really well. If you hit a Jinx, you can usually play for a top 2, even a top 1. But it's really reliant on the Jinx in order to really work. And it's also reliant on Alawi, which is pretty contested. But the idea with this is that Jinx usually want AD items. You can put full damage amp items, something like Guard Breaker, and well, let me just put it like, you can put like Shojin. You want mana gen so that she actually casts her ability, so Shojin or blue buff, we'll just put blue buff for now. And then you want to put some sort of like damage amp items or crit items on her, so like you're either going full crit, which is like IE and like Last Whisper, for example, where she just like, when she casts her ult, you basically delete the whole board and you win the game. Or you're playing something along the lines of like a Guard Breaker, Giant Slayer, where you're going for a lot of damage amps so that when she casts her ult, she just gets a lot of damage amp and she deletes the board and you win the game. Additionally, you could play these items on an Ezreal while earlier in the game. So obviously if you have like AD items, so something like, I don't know, let's just take for example like Deathblade, IE, I'm just trying to pick all sword items, and Last Whisper, you can usually put them on an Ezreal for your early game. Besides that, you're usually trying to stabilize around Zoe as a secondary carry that you're using AP items on. So a lot of times you'll have something along the lines of like Gwynsu, because she's pretty good with attack speed, and then like a Jewel Gauntlet Guard Breaker, some sort of setup where you're giving her attack speed and damage amp and crit chance, so she does a lot of damage, something like that. Now, if you think about the Academy board, a lot of times with the Academy board, you're typically trying to play around AD as well. You're either going to carry Ezreal in your mid game, Corki towards your mid or late game, but a lot of times you're trying to cap out really high around Jace. And with these units, very similarly, you can go for different types of builds. A lot of times you can just go for full crit builds. So I'm just going to put the same items here for sake of example, i.e. Last Whisper, just glove items that are pretty generic that can work on all the AD units. Additionally, on Heimer, a lot of times you want some sort of mana generation. Blue buff is pretty good, but there's other opportunities for other items. And then you also want to put stuff like Nash. I don't know if Nasher is still good, but usually just play around your Academy items. But a lot of times, like the go-to old build was blue buff Nashers, Archangels in order to cast your abilities. So when you look at these two boards, you're going to notice that a little bit of the units look pretty similar, right? I'll try and put them in the same spot so when I flicker between the two screens, you can kind of see them all, right? But let's say I do this, you can see that there's a couple units that are the same. And that's the idea of pivoting. When you're pivoting, you want to try and have different copies of units that work for multiple boards. And that's what helps you out a lot. So you want to set yourself up in your mid game and your early game to try and play around two different sides of the comps. So for example, let's say I was playing around Ezreal and Irelia in my early game. These are what I would call pivot points that you can then decide between two different boards. So for example, if I'm playing around Ezreal and Irelia, I can make items for Ezreal. Like let's say I make an IE and I make a Last Whisper. I can carry Ezreal in my mid game. And I can carry around this unit. So I want to hold on to Ezreal. And I want to hold on to Rebel and maybe playing around Rebel mid game because Rebel mid game is quite strong. Academy mid game is also strong. But because these are shared units on both boards, because usually you're playing Sentinel for both of these boards, and you're playing around Ezreal because he's not only a Rebel, he's also an Academy unit. On your bench, what you should be looking towards is holding low-cost units that work with both traits. So for example, I can play around Set and Akali, or I can play around Leona, who is a Sentinel and an Academy. I can play around Academy in my early game, and then I can either play towards Jinx and Zoe to my late game, or I can play around some combination of Jace, Corki, and Heimer. And this is the idea of pivoting between the lines. So let's say you think you have a really good spot for Academy. You're like, I have Academy items, I like my Academy units, Academy is my preferred comp because it's quite strong. If you randomly come across a Jinx, or if you randomly come across some Zoes, right? You can then decide, okay, well, looking at this spot, you know, as long as I have an Alawi and I have these units, I can then pivot and I can play Rebel because a lot of other people are playing around Heimer. Let's say somebody in your lobby just finds a Jace. Maybe a lot of people are playing around Corki. Corki is very popular. A lot of times Academy now feels really bad because before nobody really played around Corki that much. So with Academy, you can always stabilize around Heimer 2, like Corki 2 if you're stuck on level 8, and that's what helped it to stabilize a lot. Now everybody wants to play Corki because scrap is broken, blah blah blah, scrap is broken. That's just how it is in TFT. A lot of times people just like, you know, there's like comps that are really popular and then people just buy the units. It's not because Corki himself is like a giga damage dealer. He's not like the most broken unit in the game. It's just that the comp itself is just really popular because it's a really reliable comp to play scrap. So now you don't have Corki. It's really hard to stabilize around. Heimer on his own doesn't really cut it anymore. And then you have to high roll into a Jace. So a lot of times this board kind of falls apart really fast. So a lot of times if you're looking at this and you find some early copies that you can stabilize, a lot of times nobody's playing around Zoe. Like people play around Sorks now, but the idea is like if it's less contested and you can play around Zoe, then you can play a Rebel Zoe board. If you find an early Jinx, then instantly now you're in a good Rebel spot. And you just have to pay attention and be vigilant to that. So in the guide that I made before, I'm going to mute it and I'm just going to go through it. This is what I mean by holding on to both sides of the units. When I'm playing the game, I kind of went over it in this guide, so I'm just using this because I don't have the gameplay to show in a different one. But as you can see, I'm trying to play flexibly here. So what I'm doing is I'm holding both units that are Rebels on one side of my board, and I'm holding units that are Academy on the other side of my board. So here, for example, I'm obviously going to play around... like I have a Jace and a Corki, so I'm obviously going to play, or I could more easily play around the Heimer in this spot rather than playing around the Zoes. So I might commit towards the Heimer line even though I found copies of Zoes just because I have some of the high value units in it. But the idea is that I'm holding on to low cost Rebel units. You can see there's a Vex on my board. You can see there's a bunch of Sentinels on my board. I have an Irelia on my actual board, like not on my bench, on my actual board, and I'm holding on to this Ezreal. And the idea is that I made generic, in this version, it was a guide for AP flex, so I made generic AP items, and I can flex between the two of them. But a lot of times what ends up happening is that if you want to play around your pivot points, you want to just prepare yourself in such a way that you can play around those points later. So for example, in your mid game, you might have something that looks like this as a board, right? Let's just say you have, I don't know, this, and a Lux. This is like a board that you might run into, right? You have like a Sentinel front line, 3 Academy, 3 Rebel, 2 Sentinel. Let's say this is your level 5 board. So I'm going to move these up, and we're going to pretend like this bottom row is my bench. On my bench, what I might want to hold here is I might want to hold on to an extra copy of Vex, because maybe I play deeper into Rebel, especially since I'm already 4 Rebel in this case, or because I'm already like playing around Rebels. But I also want to hold on to other Academy units. And you want to use it as a resource, right? Ideally, when you're playing around pivoting, what you want to do is you want to put all of your pivot points or your pivot units on the actual board. So in this example, no matter what I'm playing, Ezreal is probably going to be on my final board. So I want Ezreal on my final board, and Irelia on my final board. So a lot of times, like before your transition round, like let's say I'm doing this, I'm going to set up myself for my level 8 roll down. You want to make sure that the first thing that you do is you put the units that are likewise usable on both boards. So Irelia, Alawi, and Ezreal, you want to make sure these aren't on your bench, they're on your actual board. So your board might look something like this, plus a bunch of extra units. And then as you hit units, you basically decide, okay, I hit Alawi goes in, I hit Zoe can go in for now. Then you might hit a Heimer, right? And then you keep track of where your pivot points are. You can put them in the middle of your board, and then you can work on both sides instead, so that it's a little bit easier for you. And you move on to your bench, the units that matter, and then the ones that you want to replace, you replace them until you finish your roll down, then you have your full board. That's like the idea of how pivoting. And that's why it's really important to have pivot points a lot of the time, because it helps you to be able to distinguish between those units. And that's just like pivoting around units. It's a very basic example, but you can find examples of that in all cases. And a lot of it comes down to what you hit, right? You can be playing a board, right? And I can easily, like, you know, let's say I just high roll myself into a Corki. If I high roll myself into a Corki, I can pivot around this Corki as a new pivot point, right? I can pivot this into Scrap, or I can pivot this into Academy, or I can pivot it into like some other comp. I wouldn't recommend other comps because they're a little bit more high roll, but let's say I have a Corki, right? When I do my level 8 roll down, I want to make sure to hold on to both, you know, copies of really good units like Jace, right? I might want to hold on to Alawi. Actually, this is a good example for, let's do this for example, right? Let's say Alawi, like these are good units that can pivot between multiple different lines as well. Like for example, let's say you find early copies of Corki or Alawi. These work really well because if you're playing around Scrap, right? If you're playing around Scrap, it works out nicely because Scrap, you make use of the Sentinel with Rumble. So having an Alawi early is pretty good. But also the pair of Alawi and Corki can work really well with like just playing around Academy with Jace and Leona. So when I'm planning around this board, you want to make sure that you're looking at the units. You're saying, okay, I'm going to always be playing Corki, so let me put Corki on the board. Let me prioritize my Corki items because this is going to be my pivot point. Now that I have my Corki and I have my Corki items, now I can basically scout out. I'll hold on to Scrap units as I see them, and I'll hold on to Academy units as I see them. And the other units, the other auxiliary units, that's fine. You can fix your board after. But you basically want to prioritize, okay, Scrap units, Academy units, I can pivot around this, and then you pivot both sides. That's like the idea with flexibly, and then based on what you're seeing. So for example, if somebody hits a Jace early, you're like, okay, I think I'm just going to commit to Scrap, and then you can just pivot and you can just play Scrap. This is like keeping your options open and looking at the point to play around. So that's basically talking about units. Now we're going to talk about items. A lot of times when you're pivoting on items, the idea is that there's multiple different types of units that can use the same items, and you should always keep an eye out for these things. Whenever you make an item, you should always go through a checklist in your head of what are all the units that can use this item. That's a good exercise that you should always do. So for example, here I kind of spoiled it a little bit because I have all of these units on. I'm just going to remove them for now. Let's say I'm start the game off with a Maddie. Guinsoo is pretty good on Maddie. So let's say I have like a Maddie 2-star. I'm trying to win streak. So I play Maddie with the Guinsoo. Guinsoo isn't that great on a lot of units, but there are a good variety of units that it can work well on that you should be able to keep in mind. So Guinsoo, a lot of times when you make a Guinsoo, you're thinking attack speed, auto attacker, who are the units that I want to think about. Sometimes you can think about Zeri, pretty reliable reroll line, or you can think about something like Twitch. Twitch is the go-to 4-cost that uses a Guinsoo. He's like the main auto attacker 4-cost. So when you're thinking about Guinsoo, you might be thinking, okay, I might play AD around Twitch and Zeri. A lot of people don't consider as well, there's a lot of AP units that also like Guinsoo. Zoe is pretty good with a Guinsoo a lot of the times. It helps her to cast a lot, especially if you're playing her with Vertical Rebel. But namely, one of the best Guinsoo holders is LeBlanc. LeBlanc doesn't really like to have mana gen items. Attack speed is something that's a lot more popular nowadays and does pretty well in the stats. So a lot of people prefer to put attack speed on LeBlanc if you want her to cast. So right now I'm showing that, like, based on the item and based on your later item drops, you can decide to pivot between lines based on what you get dropped and what your spot is for those particular items. For example, let's say I'm playing around Twitch and I get dropped Rod, right? So now I have a Rabadon. So let's just put a Rabadons, for example. Maybe Rabadons isn't the best thing. Let's say I get like, let's pick an item here that's a good AP item. Like Jewel Gauntlet, maybe. Let's say like my items are like this. I have a random Jewel Gauntlet. Yeah, maybe, you know, I'll just put Rabadons. Rabadons is fine. Rabadons makes it more clear for the viewers. Sorry that I can't decide. I'm trying to, like, on the fly make it a little bit more informative, but I think it's better if I just stick with my notes. So let's say you take Rabadons, right? Or let's say you get Double Rod. There's not really anybody in either Zeri line or Twitch line that you can really put AP items on. It's really awkward, right? Technically, if you want to play a sniper, you can put AP items on a Kog'Maw, but this is kind of fake and it's kind of a throw because you don't want to be committing so many items, or you don't want to be committing a lot of components to a unit that isn't going to be one of your main damage dealers. So you might take a Guinsoo and think to yourself, I'm going to play around Twitch and be angling towards Twitch. But you might want to pivot based on your items, because now with these item drops, my spot for Twitch has become different. It has become worse. So now what I want to do is I want to pivot around these items. So I have a Guinsoo and I have a Rabadon. What comp can I think of that can use Guinsoo and Rabadons? Well, this is AP. Maybe it's diminishing returns on Sorks, but either way, the idea is that these items are pretty good on both LeBlanc as well as Zoe, as well as some of the other Sorks, right? They both like attack speed. So I might look at this and say to myself, okay, I don't think I can go with my original plan of playing Twitch. I don't have to necessarily hard force towards Twitch, but I should consider these items and think about how I can play something else with them. Likewise, if you're angling towards Sorks, for example, and you make a Guinsoo early because you're like, okay, I'm gonna, like, let's say you have like a guaranteed LeBlanc, right? Like you have that, there's a prismatic augment where you get an emblem and then you get a guaranteed copy of a 5-cost. So maybe you're guaranteed a LeBlanc. So you say, okay, I'm going to be playing around LeBlanc this game. So you make a Guinsoo, and you're like, I'm going to be playing around LeBlanc, for example. Maybe this isn't the best example, you know what I mean. Let's say you're guaranteed a LeBlanc, but then all of a sudden you get dropped something crazy like an IE. It's like, okay, well now I can't really like play around LeBlanc as easily. There might be a line that you can play where instead you try and play around the opposite side. And that's something you should always keep in mind. So whenever you make an item, you should always think about what units the items are good for before you commit to them. The same works with a lot of other types of units. So for example, I see this a lot. Sometimes like you'll be playing a comp, like let's say you're trying to play ambushers and you're playing Smeech, and then all of a sudden somebody is contesting you. You take something like a Sterex and you think that you're going to be really cool with your Smeech, but then somebody else in the lobby has like a Smeech 2, a Smeech 3. You should be thinking about this Sterex and you should be thinking about, okay, what other units can I play that use this item? And that's a good exercise always. So you should always be already prepared to pivot to those comps in case your spot ever changes. Stuff like Enforcers with Vi if you have a lot of tempo. Stuff like, what's it called? Pit Fighters in general. Things like other reroll lines like Urgot. If you happen across them, should be good. So like even though I look like I might be playing Smeech and I think I have a good Smeech spot, if I have a Sterex gauge, I'm going to be holding on to Urgots on my bench so long as it doesn't grief my econ. I'm going to be holding on to Enforcers on my bench because I can easily take this and then use a pivot point like a Camille, you know, referencing the previous thing that I talked about. And then you can pivot between the Camille into like an Enforcer line potentially, and then you just drop the Ambushers and you play around Vi instead. Or you can pivot into a full Pit Fighter build where if you hit a bunch of Urgots, you play around that. And the idea is that whenever you make an item or whenever you do these, you have to look at the item and think to yourself, who can I pivot around with these items? Sometimes it ends up being like a full pivot as well. So for example, if you have like items, when I say full pivot, what I mean by that is that you don't really have a good pivot point, right? Like you're playing around Smeech and you don't have any copies of these units and you only have the item. This is going to be a very hard transition if you're just going to completely change your board from something like Ambushers, for example, where there isn't much of a connection to another comp, right? and then just like suddenly say to yourself, okay, well on my roll down, I'm just gonna play like Vi and everybody, all the enforcers, and you just put in your team planner. It makes it very awkward. So you have to be really careful not to just like pre-make a decision based on your item what you're gonna play. You should always be angling a comp, but you should never be committing to a comp until you have units of it. Once you have the units of the comp, like if I just find a Vi here, then it's like, okay, I'm committed because now I have stability. You can't just say, I'm going to play Vi if you don't have a Vi, because if you don't have a Vi, you're screwed. And that's where like full pivots becomes really difficult a lot of the times. Now we should talk about pivoting within a line. So I have 2 examples here. I talked about these in guides for the respective synergies, but the idea is that if you have a comp where there are multiple different types of carries, you can then decide based on what other people are doing and based on your spot, which ones you want to play of those particular carries. So I say this a lot. For example, we'll start with ambushers. So I'm going to move these Sorks at the bottom row. So we're talking about ambushers right now. If you're level 6 and you have a lot of Camilles, you could just reroll Camille. Like, let's say this is what happens. Let's say you just find a bunch of Camilles. So this is your Camille 2-star, and then you have 2-star, and you have 1-star, right? Let's say this is what your board looks like. A lot of times what you can decide to do is, okay, I'm like 1 or 2 off of Camille. I'll just roll for Camille 3-star, stabilize around this, and put my AP items here and play around Camille. That's like a very common thing. A lot of times if you natural Camille 3, you just play around Camille. Now, Camille isn't the go-to pick for ambushers. A lot of the times, people will not play Camille because she's generally weaker compared to the other 2 carries, which are Smeech and Echo. So then what happens is a lot of times you like get a couple Camilles, you play Camille in your early game, and then you decide, okay, now I'm going to play Smeech later. And then you roll on level 7, and you try and go for Smeech 3. Let's say you're contested on reroll ambushers. I wouldn't recommend contesting ambushers ever. If somebody looks like they're committed ambushers and they're playing reroll ambushers, I would just dodge that comp because the comp requires a lot on tempo and hitting all of the units effectively. You can see more in my ambusher guide when I talk about it. I'm not going to go into it in much detail. But let's just say you're in a spot where you're contested and you don't know what to do, right? And you're trying to play around Smeech and you're trying to play around Camille. Then what ends up happening a lot of times is that somebody will re-roll the low cost units, right? Somebody will go for Camille 3-star and Smeech 3-star, and then another person, either you or the other person, depending on the spot between the 2 of you, if one of you can afford to level and is more high roll than the other, then they can level and you can play around Echo. Sometimes you even go on level 8 and you try and tempo around an Echo carry. This is pivoting within a line. So I'm playing all the same units, except I'm just deciding which unit is going to be my main carry that I'm going to prioritize items for. Sometimes it's good, like it's really easy to play between Camille and Smeech because they use relatively the same items. They're both AD units. But sometimes you have to make your decision a lot earlier if you're playing around something like Echo, because Echo is an AP unit. So the auxiliary items that you make on Echo are going to be different from the ones that you would make on Smeech and Camille. And why that is important is because you always want to prioritize the items on your main damage dealer, right? It's better to have a 3-item Echo if Echo is my main carry than it is to have a 3-item Smeech and just hope that I have Echo items later. You want to prioritize on carousel components that work towards your main carry. So this is the idea of pivoting between a line. Now, like I said, I wouldn't necessarily do this with ambushers, but one comp that it really applies to is Sorks. Sorks is really popular, especially since they changed it to be a max of 6 Sork. The 6 Sork buff / change / rework has made many different Sork lines be a very viable AP option. Now, what I think the best AP option is to reroll Nami 3-star and Swain 3-star. This is a very high roll option, but it is usually the most stable and the most reliable in terms of guaranteeing a top 4. Because the Sork comp relies a lot on doing burst damage without having a lot of sustain. However, if you have a Swain 3, you eliminate a lot of that because it gives you enough sustain to do burst damage, and so does the Nami gives you enough burst damage that they synergize really well. Like, you can put Swain in the front line, or if you need to do a lot of damage and you have other frontline units that are upgraded, you can even do Swain backline, and these 2 in the backline, it's almost always game winning. These units are broken in the backline, right? But a lot of times, if other people are playing Sork, Swain is also a very contested unit. So what ends up happening is you can't necessarily play around rerolling Swain and rerolling Nami. So what you should do a lot of the times is, oops, I didn't mean to remove it. I just meant remove the stars. So I'll put Nami back. A lot of times what you can do is you can decide to push levels and you can play around the other units. This is pivoting within a line. So the idea is that instead of playing around Swain carry, you are now going to level and play around maybe like a Swain 2-star, and then by the time you hit Zoe, you play Zoe 2-star, and then use it to tempo until you can find a LeBlanc. Because with the Sork line, if you're 6 Sork LeBlanc 2, you pretty much win the game. This LeBlanc got buffed to a point where, like, some people still don't believe in LeBlanc damage. I've played enough of these Sork games that as soon as somebody has LeBlanc 2, they just instant win the game. It is so fucking strong. Like, especially when you're playing like anything. If you're playing Sork Emissary, if you're playing Sork Form Swapper, if you're playing like no matter what you're playing, the damage amp and all the like everything that she does, she just does so much damage. Like, units just die instantly. So she is very strong. But the idea is that you can't just like start the game off and be like, I'm just gonna play LeBlanc 2. So a lot of times you have to pivot within the line to find yourself the best solution to eventually get to the LeBlanc 2. And that's like the idea. So this works really well. Like, you can start your game out thinking to yourself, I'm gonna Nami reroll, Swain reroll. Then you look around, a bunch of people are holding Namis, a bunch of people are holding Swains. Okay, I'm gonna use my early game that I probably am high rolling, because if you're rerolling these units, you're in a high roll spot. I'm gonna level to 8. Then you can play Emissary Sorks, for example, right? That's pivoting within a line, because then you just play the Emissary variation, right? You play Emissary with 4 Sork, and then you level and you play 6 Sork eventually. Or you can just play like Vertical Sork with Black Rose. These are options that are within the line, and you just decide which variation you want to play. I go through Sork variations in the Sork guide as well, so I'm not going to go through them in great detail here. Now, one thing I do want to always say is that I say a lot like who has the better spot. A lot of times it's very difficult to tell who has the better spot. But typically what you should always think about is, if you're looking between yourself and somebody else of playing the same comp, whether it's a 4-cost comp, a reroll, like anything, no matter what it is, you should look at who has more gold, who has more of the units in question, and who has more HP. Technically there's other stuff that matters, like augments and items, but typically whoever has more gold, more of the units, and more HP, usually you can outlive the opponent, right? If you're missing 2 out of the 3, you definitely need to pivot. In my opinion, a lot of the times, I am a person who I enjoy the game more when I am pivoting and I am playing something that other people aren't playing. I think the most horrible experience in TFT is Warwick Encounter, and then the second most horrible experience is the when you're playing a comp and somebody else is playing the same comp as you, and you're just butting heads and you just both go bot 4. I think it's miserable. So often, if you have a worse spot than somebody else, there's no need to drag them down and ruin their gameplay experience, unless it's like your best play. And then if somebody is contesting you, you should also look at their spot and understand, if it's their best play, they have to contest you. There's many games I play where I'm like, this sucks, I'm getting contested, but that guy has no other options with his items, his units, his gold, so he just has to play it. But if you have an option to pivot, you should usually pivot if you have like the resources to do so. Or if you're in a worse spot than the other person. Because if you're dying anyways, you know, a lot of times you might be able to get some better placements if you just don't be like quote unquote stubborn with what your comp is. But you should always think about your spot, evaluate, look at your board, say, am I gonna hit? Am I more likely to hit, or is the other person more likely to hit? That's what it comes down to. If the other person is more likely to hit, then you should think to yourself, okay, so if that person's more likely to hit, should I pivot or should I keep the same comp? I'll give you an example here with my own gameplay. I wonder if okay, I'll show it here. I don't actually have the video for this one because it happened too long ago, so my bad. So I'm just gonna explain to you what happened, and then I'm gonna show you the end result. So basically what happened is, there were me and another player in the lobby both had a really good spot for a particular comp. So at the start of the game, I had an Urgot 2-star, and I got offered Unleash the Beast. So Control F, Unleash the Beast. This is gain a Asterix gauge, and when the effects triggers, the user gains 35% attack speed for the rest of combat, whatever, right? So I had a really good spot to play Urgot reroll, because this Unleash the Beast with Urgot, you just make as many Asterix as you can and you win the game. It's that easy. It's really broken, it's really strong, it's way more powerful than anything else. Unleash the Beast is supposed to be pretty generic, that you just put on like most frontline users and you can kind of get Asterix gauge and play around it, but it became like a broken thing with Urgot in particular as of like the last couple of patches. The other person that I was playing against had Tristana, and they hit the Artillerist augment, which is called Rocket Collection, right? Now, they didn't scout me. I selected the augment first. I'm not going to say that. I'm just saying that it was on stream. You guys can see I was talking about it on stream. But I selected the augment first. The person didn't scout me, and they took Rocket Collection, which gives them a Tristana and Urgot. So they had this board, Tristana 2-star and Urgot 1-star. Now, looking at my spot, technically I have an augment that is more generic that I can pivot. So if I'm looking at my spot, I'm thinking to myself, okay, should I pivot or should I not pivot? Now, I had Urgot with a single Sterix, and I said to myself, I think that my spot is good because I have an Urgot too. In the worst case scenario, the other player with Gold Collector isn't going to put Gold Collector on Urgot. It's not a good Urgot item. It's a good Tristana item. It's a good Corki item. So I said, that person shouldn't really be playing around Urgot from their spot. So I'm going to keep playing Urgot here. I could pivot, but it's not in my best interest because of how broken this combination is. And I'm not just going to pivot or decide to pivot here just because another person is playing the same comp as me. There's technically enough 2 costs for us both to hit. I'm going to outlive him for sure. Like, my combination is more broken than his combination. So this guy decided to just play Urgot reroll anyways. So he had Rocket Collection, and he played around Urgot as well. So we were contesting each other. But I did not pivot because of how broken the combination was. My spot for the comp was really good, especially since I started the game with an Urgot 2. So eventually I hit Urgot 3, and I went first in this game. This is the game. So I have a Radiant. My items look weird, I think. I forget. Maybe this isn't the game. I think this is the game, though. Oh, no. I think it's this game, maybe. Let me see. No, it was this game. I can't remember. It was this game. So I had basically, I didn't have the best Urgot items at the end, I don't think. But basically, I got I took Unleash the Beast, and then I got a Radiant Sterix from an upgrade because I think it was like Powder Monkey example. And then the other guy, this was the Rocket Collection guy, yeah. So it just worked out. Like, he tried to not play around Urgot, right? He ended up trying to play around Corki, which is fine. But this is what I mean, right? I didn't pivot off of playing Artillerist and playing Urgot because I know how broken this combination is. It's unfortunate they also bought Forge because they tried their best. But a big problem was, like, this guy made Urgot items. But it's fine because it worked out for him. I'm not trying to flame. I'm just trying to say, like, in this example, I wish I had the video, which I don't. But the idea is that because my spot is so good for Urgot, I didn't pivot and I still went first, right? And that's, like, the important part, right? If you have a really good spot, you shouldn't just pivot for the sake of pivoting. You should always evaluate whether your spot is good to give yourself the maximum placement, right? And that's something I just want everybody to take home, because whenever I make these play flexible guides, I don't want people, especially if you're a beginner player, to just constantly be switching your board around if it doesn't actually benefit you. Because if I switched off of Urgot, like, I could have, it would have been easier for me not to hit Urgot, but because I had so many copies of Urgot and I had Unleashed the Beast, it was almost a no-brainer not to switch. But I could have played around Vi, I could have played around Mbessa, but it's like, why do I have to ensue that risk, right? Instead, I decided to just stay level 6, roll for Urgot 3. If I hit Urgot 3, I hit Urgot 3. I already started with so many copies of Urgot that I was stable for much of my game, so I had a lot of HP, I had a lot of gold, I had a really good spot. So this guy eventually looked at it and said, okay, I can't really contest it because he has more gold than me, he has a better spot. And then, you know, it didn't work out for him, unfortunately, but I ended up just re-rolling on level 6, and then I hit everything, and I win the game out. And that's, like, the idea there. So, that's everything. Thanks for watching. Hopefully this was somewhat useful. It is kind of a rehash of this other video that I made, but just a little bit more generic. Of, like, talking about flex units, which I did a month ago. So hopefully it's a good refresher if you watch that video as well. But just make sure to understand the couple concepts, right? Have your pivot points. Understand what your units could turn into, right? If you're going to pivot your board based on the units, if you're going to pivot your board based on the items, have a plan B, even if it's not your best plan B. But above all else, analyze your board and say to yourself, is it better for me to pivot, or should I just continue playing the comp that I'm angling because it is a stronger comp, like, for example, like that I gave. So that's just the idea. Hopefully that was informative. Hopefully it was fun. It was a little bit lengthy here because I was trying to show as many examples as possible. But yeah, sorry, no gameplay. My VOD got deleted. I don't know why, but my bad. I think it was just too old and I didn't download it. So that's on me. But next guide, I will make sure to have gameplay video as well. Thumbs up all around. Thanks for watching and see ya. Bye bye.